Welcome to Season 3 of the Knack 4 Business Podcast. Over 350 episodes strong, we're here to ignite your entrepreneurial spirit with fresh insights, networking gems, and creative strategies that elevate your game.
From an audience perspective, why does it feel like your team isn't hearing each other, even when you're using the same words? That's exactly what John will talk about in this episode. He'll unpack why your team might not be misaligned, they're just speaking different languages. Using the sync method and the concept of breaking the curse of Babel, John helps leaders decode the invisible friction caused by siloed language, culture, and assumptions across departments. If you want your people to finally get each other and move forward together, tune in to hear how aligning communication can unlock purpose, performance, and true mutual prosperity. Our guest today is John Taylor McEntire from Mutual Prosperity. John is a cross-cultural strategist and creator of the Sync method, which stands for Synchronize Yourself Naturally Within Your Community. He's worked across the U.S., Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, helping leaders and organizations align communication, culture, and innovation. His unique lens blends systems thinking with Eastern and Western leadership wisdom. He's known for turning invisible communication blocks into visible breakthroughs. John, pleasure to have you here. Welcome. Do you have a favorite quote or saying, sir?
I have lots of different things I'm interested in, but I didn't learn alignment from org charts. I learned it backstage in translation booths and over tea with cross-cultural teams.
So the curse of Babel, it has a connotation of you're building a tall tower and it's going to tip over. How does that show up in business, though, in more practical terms?
What people don't recognize often is that each of their departments speak different languages. So you have your techie people speaking tech language, like code or whatever that company's doing. You have your finance people speaking finance talk, and your PR people speaking marketing. They have their own way of using jargon. Oftentimes that jargon is confusing to the other departments, and that needs to be aligned. Just think about growing up in your home or neighborhood. You may be growing up the same way as your family members or schoolmates, but you have a particular way of talking that's different than what other people do. So your experiences in your family growing up, the way that you view the world is different. And so that perspective has its own way of being talked about and brought out from that person. Each person has their own individual peculiarity. That's why even if your brother or sister grew up in the same home as you, you think differently. Oftentimes there's misconceptions because somebody else may think that's meaning something different than what you meant.
It sounds like every spousal conversation anybody ever had recently, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right.
Tell me, how do you know something's out of sync in your team?
How do you know that something's out of sync in your team? It's when you recognize that things are going amiss. If you're in a meeting and somebody throws out something about code or whatnot, that happens to be a techie person, your IT guy, and they say something, but somebody from marketing or HR kind of rolls their eyes or they shut up. That's when you know that something's amiss. And so it's really important to try and get those things aligned and get people on the same page. If you think about the Tower of Babel, there was this large community, the world was, from their viewpoint, was trying to create this tower. And this tower was actually going pretty well at first. But the goal of the tower was not pleasing to God. God then confused the language. And so once they weren't able to talk to each other anymore and they were speaking different languages, what used to be smooth sailing all of a sudden just fell apart. So they were never able to finish the tower. That was because of this change in the language, the change in how their viewpoints were, and not being able to have that communication made it so that the people couldn't work. So in modern organizations, we have engineers, they speak in code, marketing speaks in emotion, finance speaks in numbers, and then HR in engagement metrics. And so that's where most conflicts start, in a translation gap, not an intent, but really an interpretation.
So is that more about the unshared understanding of words? If I say I think back to my experiences in the healthcare industry. IT PRN stands printer, but if you're talking to a nurse or a doctor, that's not the printer they're talking about. That's about meds or the next steps. Is that kind of unshared understanding then?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's basically we know what we know and we relate certain words to what we do. That example you gave was a great example. When people think in their own mode and they're not able to cross over and say, oh, maybe I need to say this in a different way to get my point across. Maybe I need to speak similar to how that person would speak. And most of that doesn't happen automatically. People need to be taught how to do that, working with that to figure things out. A company called TechVision, and this is when talent isn't enough. TechVision is an AI startup. They had all the funding, talent, and momentum necessary. But at the critical product launch, the entire team became unglued. And what happened was that the engineering was so obsessed with all the algorithms. They flagged the changing customer behavior, but they weren't able to get heard in regards to their noticing this customer behavior was changing. Marketing built campaigns based on outdated specs, so there wasn't this crossover in regards to what the technical side or productization was doing. Marketing went gung-ho on outdated specs, and finance saw red flags in the burn rate, but they were completely tuned out. At the launch, the product didn't match market needs, the message didn't match the product, and the funding couldn't keep pace with the disconnect. They didn't need a new CRM. They needed a new conversation. They needed to be synced together. So that's a big example in regards to how things can go awry. But it's really making sure that everybody is understanding what the main goal is, the end goal is, and how does their part. I talk about how people are a piece of the puzzle of life, but they're also a piece of the puzzle of their organization. And so that interconnectedness of those puzzle pieces needs to be really solid. And unless they're connecting really well, it's not going to go well. They need to be really connected and really in sync, really understanding how each of those pieces of that puzzle fits together. How does the piece of the productization or the technical side work with the factory floor in building the product? Or how does the marketing come into play? When do they come into play? And how do you keep the people updated in regards to those things? It's keeping those puzzle pieces completely enmeshed together, making sure they're aligned, but also making sure that they understand how their piece fits with the others and how that relates to the end result.
Tell me about the sync method and how it got created.
So the sync method was based on my life, basically, and 36 years worth of working in corporate, working in entrepreneurial environments, working with different groups, working in academia. Each one of those types of organizations are different and have different ways of thinking. But what happened when I was growing up was that it was the dinner table helped me understand language and culture were so important. What happened at my dinner table was that we constantly had an influx of new people, new faces, new cultures, new languages coming into the dining table. We had international exchange students from Japan and Germany. We had a lady and her baby from Uruguay lived with us. So I had Japanese type of influence. I had this German influence, and then also the Spanish influence. And then I had Navajo foster brothers that lived with us for many years, understanding a little bit of the tribal concepts, and that each one of these different types of people had a unique way of viewing the world, had a unique way of talking about things, had a unique way of sharing themselves. It was very enlightening to me. One Christmas Eve, we went to the airport and picked up a Laotian family, and there were 6 of them. There was a husband and a wife, the husband's sister, and 3 children, 6 and under. They were fleeing Laos during a civil war. They were humanitarian refugees, and we supported them for 6 months. They came in on Christmas Eve. They gave up our Christmas to get them situated. The husband and the wife were actually upper crust, and he was a PhD, but because they couldn't speak English very well, it was hard for him to get work at his level. As I watched this situation, I realized that we're all at a disadvantage when another thing that my family did, which I didn't understand was different from others. When you grow up in your own environment, you think that's normal for everybody. So not only did I have this dinner table with this rotating group of people talking about things in different ways and using different languages, I was also traveling quite a bit. One year we would travel extensively throughout the United States, and then the next year we would travel internationally. By the time I was 22, I had traveled to 19 countries in all 50 states and 8 provinces in Canada. We had taken a drive on the Alpine Highway going through Canada to Alaska. It was just an exciting thing, but this really opened up my thinking, being able to view people from the fact that their culture is unique to them and something valuable that I could actually learn from and help me understand how to communicate with them better and help them understand me better. Growing up was really critical. When I was 9 years old, I performed in theater. From 9 to 19, I was in over 30 productions and did everything from stage to some television, some vocal recordings. I'm a singer, and also some dramatic recordings. And so with all those different things, I actually learned that inside the theater, there was this community. And this community was like a city. And you had the mayor of the city was the director. And that director, everything that director did led the whole group. If that director was really good at communicating their view of the end result and how to coax each one of those actors or different players in that environment to do their job. We're not just talking about the stars of the show being the ones that make the show big. It's everybody from the stars to the villagers, to the stagehands, to the people doing the lights and the sound. I recognize that everybody had a place. Recognizing that early on helped me understand that when you're in any world, you need to have somebody directing things and other people following, but there needs to be a way that director is pulling people together. Those things were really instrumental in me understanding how to move forward. When I was in university, I was studying Japanese, and that was my major because I had been a missionary in Japan for 2 years for my church. And I realized at that time that Japan is really starting to economically grow. I was really interested in the fact that Japan had this knack for having everything go smoothly. You have Kaizen and all these consensus building tools, and I was just really drawn to those. When it comes to the synchronized part of sync, that's where the consensus building of the Japanese comes about. The fact that language is really important and crucial, it's helped me understand that this curse of Babel is out there, and that as I was a minority going into Japan, I recognized how a minority feels in that environment. And when your language is not up to par with the natives, it makes it so you have to understand how you can relate to them better. Now, when I was in university, I changed my major to Japanese. I had a minor in Asian studies, and with that minor, I needed to study 2 other languages. So I had Mandarin Chinese and Korean. This brought in another aspect of how these different languages work together. That's what made me who I am. When I graduated in Japanese and business, I went back to Japan to be a consultant. And from that professional environment, I was thrown into ways where I had to understand how I played with others. That's where part of the synchronized part is also understanding the orbs of influence. So you have the language aspects, but you need to understand the orbs of influence and how you deal with different people. As a young consultant, I was working with presidents of Sony, JVC, Panasonic, and executive vice presidents. It helped me understand my low position in regards to them, but how this relationship needed to happen. So throughout that, I was in Japan for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, which was 1994, that's when Japan's economy tanked. And so I was not only out of money because I hadn't been paid for about 6 months, but there were no jobs to get. We came back to the States, and then after that, I ended up in technology transfer at universities. Technology transfer is what universities are obligated to do with the research results that come out of universities. They need to have an office that looks at those research results, determines if there's something valuable and if they should proceed to license it to somebody else to be commercialized and become products and services. So if you look at your cell phone, a lot of the components in there, the GPS, the touch screen, actually come from universities. I am a Jack Canfield Success Principles methodology trainer. The yourself part is understanding how you can become a better leader and all the different components there. When it comes to naturalize, it's understanding all these different cultural aspects, this historical context that you're coming from, and bringing those into to help you become more than what you are. So one aspect that I work on here is intuition. How do people use intuition? I believe everybody has an opportunity to use intuition, but it's hard to grasp. And so how do you use that? The Koreans have a thing called nunchi. And what that is, being able to read the room. How do you bring that kind of context in? And then lots of things from Taoist philosophy, these different aspects from historical context comes into play with this naturalize. And then communitize is like, how do you deal with tribes and take the good parts out of it, but leave the silo mentality? How do you make the community more connected and beneficial? That's think right there.
That is really comprehensive. Wow. Your background, your exposure to different elements, languages. Jack Canfield caused Wayne to have a total smile on his face because he's a Jack Canfield coach himself.
Awesome.
The synchronicity is rolling through here. It is a really wide breadth of between the cultures and the different positions people have. How does age play a role in it? Because if I'm 5, not as much experience, but everything is possible. If I'm 15 or 17, full of life, 20s and 30s are years of exploration and maybe a bit of danger. 40s and 50s, okay, I've done it all. Let's go for that calm ride. And then you hit the 60s to 70s is not, this is the only way it works. How do you bring that communication process in when you span that? It's almost like having multiple cultures.
Well, and it's a really smart thing to bring up in regards to the generational aspects. It's not only we've all grown up in different generations, but we've grown up in our own generation, and our own generation has certain things. Being a baby boomer, I'm at the tail end of the baby boomers, has a certain way of thinking, and then you got Gen X and everybody after that. It's important to understand not only the age category that people are in, but also the grouping that they're in and the way that the society affected them. Our Gen Zers they've had to deal with a lot of things that we didn't have to deal with in our youth, with COVID and all these other aspects. We're all dealing with COVID, but it affects us differently because of the way that we're grown up and the way that we actually deal with each other. It comes back to the language issue. What language are these different generations using? It's important that we get people on an even playing field so that they understand the value from each of these generations. Of course, the older generations always think they have all the answers, but the youngest generations don't want to hear that. They're trying to test things, and how you speak with them in a way they can accept is really important. So that's another language factor that comes into play, another cultural factor that comes into play.
One thing based on your age you mentioned and being in theater, we had live theater, we had film. Now we're dealing with social media and Facebook and Instagram. Does the media change the perspective, or is media?
I think you're onto something there, Wayne. I think it does change the perspective depending on what medium it is. When you look especially at the younger generation and social media, that's definitely more important than what's going on the big screen. They're always looking at their mini screens, and that's their life. And we need to understand, well, in all those different categories of media, need to understand how they actually reach these different audiences, and that becomes very difficult. But the media, when you have these short videos that comes from social media, which grabs people's attention, that's more important. You have these influencers, if you will, that are promoting this certain lifestyle and this way of thinking and such. And if they didn't have the ability to have the social media engines and such, and then have the video, they wouldn't become as successful as they are. And you wouldn't have this vast what competition in regards to those eyes.
Can you just have the language alignment matrix? How do businesses use it?
So basically what we do is we go into a company, an organization, and really try to help them understand. First of all, we'll talk with the leader, the CEO or president, whoever is leading the organization, and try to get a feel for how they think the communication is going. What comes out of this is that they'll say, I'm letting people know what they need to do, but they're not doing it. I feel what's being said is going in one ear and out the other. And then we talk through that and I get a feel for who was in the organization, what are the different departments, how do those departments work, and help them understand that this type of thing is normal. It's hard to get everything to be gelled completely together from the beginning, especially as organizations grow. This is where most of my work comes from. These organizations that have been around for 3 to 5 years, they've gone from that core 3 to 4 people to maybe 10 to 50 people. And that's when communication goes awry, because these 3 to 4 people were really synced. They were together. They helped create this vision. They helped create the mood to go forward. They were in sync in regards to all their steps. They knew how their pieces fit together and everything. But as new people come on board, those people don't have that background. And so they need to be brought up to speed. They need to recognize what the mission is, where the mission came from, where it's going, but then also understand that they are part of that mission and what part they are supposed to play in that mission and what's expected to come out of that. And a lot of this discussion doesn't really take place. You've got HR who hires these people and they hire them of a checklist. The person has these certain skills, these abilities, this expertise, this experience, but what they don't have is really what makes that person tick, and how do they speak and how do they communicate, and what makes them really excited about something, and what are the things that actually to make them want to pull back and not be involved. I tell these leaders that the puzzle piece they give to somebody, or that somebody's going to be coming in, you need to give margin around that puzzle piece so they can actually grow into that and become more of what they are. Back to the language alignment matrix, when you think about all these differences and the reasons for being that each of these employees have and how they feel they're going to fit with others, we need to make sure that they're aligned with their language. So we pull people together as a team and watch the discussion going on. What leaders can do, and what I teach leaders to do, is that if somebody comes up with an acronym from the technical side and you've got people rolling their eyes or looking lost, you make sure that person stops and reminds people what that acronym means. And it's better that this type of thing takes place fairly regularly. So when people are lost in the language and jargon, they can be brought into that. And then those speaking can start to understand the sensitivity of what they're talking about and maybe talk about it in a different way so people can understand it. So it's really important for people to understand that if you can put it into terms of maybe speaking to a 10th grader and helping them understand, that's part of aligning the language, getting rid of the jargon or making sure that everybody understands the jargon. So another part of the language alignment matrix is to have an ability to keep tabs in regards to what these different points of discussion actually mean. So you have your terminology listed, and then you have a definition in regards to what that word means, and it helps people really work towards understanding that element and bring those together. So there's a lot of different activities that can be done to help people align their language, and it's really having those discussions and letting the discussion go fluidly at the points where there is possible disconnect or somebody is new in the room. That's when you need to pull back and make sure that everybody has it in their mind that when they're talking about something, they need to backtrack a little bit and give a little bit of historical context or definition in regards to what is meant to be said. And then also relate it to how what they're talking about relates with the other person and how the pieces of the puzzle work together. So it's a tandem of using language to pull people together, culture, but also perspective, make sure those all fit together.
So if you have all this in play, there's another factor that rolls in here, and it's the personality. Some people are dominant, other people are more wallflowerish type of thing. Not necessarily they don't have import to say or don't have impact either. Ego, like how does that drive the communications? If you're at a fire hall, it's like hustle, hustle. Everything's a short, quick communication versus going to a restaurant with your spouse or companion or friend. You're not, these are all different influences. Ego plays in there and context also plays in there. How do you wrap it in so that it's appropriate, a smooth fit?
And that's part of where the culture that the leader brings in is really playing a key. If the culture is shared very authentically and clearly with some vulnerability, then people are going to connect to it better. This is where the synchronized part happens, where you're aligning your people systems and your strategy. You need to help people understand that each one of those groups, each one of those departments, each one of those projects have people from different departments that are being worked on together, and the viewpoints of each of those people are important. And as you're building that consensus, the leader needs to have the vision and set the tone for the mission and everything. I believe that if the people in that company are able to be perceived, if they perceive themselves that they're being accepted as a big, important piece of that puzzle, and they understand how they fit in, they buy into the mission. And that buying into the mission brings this camaraderie that helps dispel some of those things you were talking about. But of course, ego does come into play. And this is where culture also comes into play. So my view is that leaders need to be looking at culture from a global perspective. And it's not just wanting to take their products and services out globally. That's one aspect of what I help with. But in our global community now, we have so many people from different places in our organizations that help us to do the things that we need to. But every one of those people have been raised in a different way, raised in a different environment. So when you look at the people who are coming from Asia, it's a very hierarchical society that they came from. So when they're in their educational situations, they have their teacher as the sensei if you're in Japan, and they revere that sensei, and they don't ever talk back to that sensei, and they don't necessarily question the sensei. That would be rude. And so that understanding of where these people came from culturally is really important, because that's a very indirect way of communicating. That's what they learn in Asia and parts of the Arab culture. But when you get into the Western culture, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, you've got people who are more direct and more curt. They just want to get things done. The Germans are very curt. And so you have to help people understand that the different ways of talking, the different ways of communicating, the different cultures, somehow they need to mesh together. As a leader, putting people in a place where they understand how their talking may be affecting adversely those people that they're working around. And so it's pulling them out. So this also goes into play in regards to the generations. What makes those generational thought patterns come into play when you have parents and child relationship? There's always some friction there, and it's a generational thing, and it's an age thing also. But it's that same type of thing goes on in a work environment where we have 4 and coming into 5 different generations working in the same environment. So it's pulling them all together, helping people understand that they need to recognize that they have their place, but other people have their place, and how do you smooth those together? This is where hiring is really important. I think it's more important to hire people who have higher emotional intelligence than it is to hire somebody who has the highest technical skill, because technical skill can be taught to a certain point. Of course, some people are more talented than others, but if you're going solely off the technical skill and they don't have that emotional intelligence, then it's going to be very hard for them to actually mesh with the group as a whole.
You have done a great job unpacking about group dynamics in fairly large companies. Is there something a solopreneur can do so that he's using language or she's using language with their customer better and without silos, using these tools that were maybe designed for the 1,000-person company?
I actually feel that my tools are made for any leader. It's actually easier to use the sync method from the starting point of a company than it is to try and bring it into these larger organizations that have already had lots of different training and different thought patterns. Working with smaller entrepreneurs is fun, first of all, and it feels like you're able to do maybe a lot more with them than you can with a large organization. Of course, it does affect a large organization, but the momentum with a smaller team hitting that sweet spot, they're going to be going up in their productivity and everything because of using the sync method. That's where a lot of fulfillment comes from me. It's really, how can I help people fulfill their goals and dreams as a leader? And then how does that affect the organization that they work with?
As you were describing different jobs, different roles people have, there are some that are, having worked inside a healthcare space, that there tend to be certain type of personalities within each department. And it helps them get to provides their unique knack of skill of being able to do their work. Some people are highly attention detailed, in the weeds, they live and breathe it. Other people, their omniscient view is what they're looking for. They're looking for that large picture. Sometimes those cross communications, they're not going to bind. How do you bridge it so that if you're pushing out a communique, it's always targeted to your audience? How do you push out a piece of communication that will resonate with the person who likes enough detail and a person who doesn't want too much detail, because you have them for 3 seconds and the third sentence beyond that, you're gone. They've already flipped the page or flipped right or left, one of those things. How do you deliver that communication so that it addresses that space?
Let me preface this with one aspect of my growing up. I started working when I was 11 years old, and that's when I had a paying job. And I started working in my father's orthopedic practice, and I was a file clerk. And as I was this file clerk, but I was the doctor's son, I thought I was quite special. And I was really put in my place by my father, okay, from the very first week. And he says, you may be special to me because you're my son, but you're just one of the team here. If you can't play like the team, then you're not going to be anything. You need to make a decision as to how you're going to treat people. I understood that working with people who at that time may seem below me, that's what people think. And I'm just being very vulnerable here. It really put me in my place, and I understood that I need to make sure that I worked with Erlene, who was the office manager, and that I was to go to her beck and call, not her to me. And so then from that activity in being a file clerk and understanding how important it was to keep the file records in order, it helped me understand things. I've done so many different jobs: cleaning mansions, doing yard work, working in the cornfields, delivering newspapers, flipping hamburgers at Wendy's, delivery for Domino's Pizza. I managed apartment buildings for my father, and he was like a slumlord. And so we didn't have these really gorgeous places, and so they were cheaply rented and everything, but there was always messes to clean up, and it wasn't fun, and it was hard working with different groups of people. I sold cars, clothing, jewelry. I managed a technical lab while I was in university, helping educators work with visualizing technology, using PowerPoint. All these different jobs helped me understand. I was actually walking in the shoes of other people to understand how they felt doing their job and how I felt when I felt belittled because somebody wasn't treating my position or what others were doing in a meaningful way. I learned that I didn't want to be treating people outside of how their job needed to be respected. Going back to the theater analogy, everybody from the person who was sweeping that stage floor to the star of the show, everybody has a place, and nobody's more important than anybody else. Even that director's not more important than anybody else. everybody has to be together. So when you're in that green room, you need to make sure that everybody's chilling and vibing in the right way. I knew we were going to have a great show when we were just chilled and so connected and everything, versus the times when there was these petty jealousies and things going on. And so it was the tenor of that director that brought things to a point where reconciliation was necessary. When I worked in Doha, Qatar, for the Qatar Foundation, I worked with people from 65 different countries. And so to try and get people to understand all those different elements and how all those different people work together. Now, of course, I didn't work completely with everybody from all those different countries, but still I had to work with so many different people from different countries as I was building their innovation ecosystem with 8 universities, 3 national research labs, and 2 research hospitals, trying to make sure that those were working well within the system. But then you had this hierarchy of the royal family and then the Qatari nationals who are at the top of the food chain. And then you've got the Americans and the British and Canadians and Germans and Japanese, and it goes down on this economic ladder. So all those different people are treated differently and thought of differently. How do you make sure that everybody feels like they're doing well? When I've worked abroad, I've always found it fascinating. The Filipinos that I've worked with have been amazing people. And there's something about that culture that has brought this servant leadership type mentality into play. And so I was always enthralled with how they could be so happy, even though people were speaking down at them. It's this frame of mind that each one of us has to have in regards to how does our piece of the puzzle fit with others, and how can we make it mesh better, and what can I do to help it so that it's accepted easier by those who I'm around, and what can I do with my attitude to make sure that comes to fruition.
You are where you are. If you had that crystal ball, you were looking at 3 to 5 years, where do you see mutual prosperity for you and maybe the world?
So let me tell you one of the aspects in regards to these consensus building tools that I talk about. One of them is nemawashi. And nemawashi is a term that comes from gardening. So you have these bonsai masters who are clipping and pruning these trees, and you have these asymmetrical beauties. They're keeping the tree as a dwarf, but these trees are just beautiful. And everybody goes gaga over the fact that they're clipping and stuff, but it's not just the clipping on the outside that's important, or putting the wires and everything. There's something that happens underneath. It's the roots. And that's where nemawashi comes into play. Ne means root, and mawasu means to turn around, dig around the roots. Ultimately, these masters have learned that they need to work with the roots. They need to give breathing room and everything. This is helping to prepare for that plant to be transplanted from one pot to another pot or another plot. And they'll take dirt from that new place and bring it in and stir that in. It has time to settle before it's transplanted. So when it's transplanted, it has more ability to have less trauma in that transplantation. It has a better ability to grow and flourish. Nemawashi is important for us to lay the groundwork when we're putting a new project together, when we're working with a new team. We're always needing to work with the roots of the team and make sure we're all meshing together. In my work, I've dealt with hundreds of startups, and part of it was licensing to startups or consulting with startups, and on all different technical fields I've worked in. And what I've seen is that as some startups get momentum, they get lots of traction and interest. And so when there's an acquisition that comes to play, it's during this acquisition time that I really feel frustration, because this team that has built this very innovative ecosystem, they're now being uprooted and they're being put into a larger organization. When this buyout happens, the leader, the CEO, the founders tend to be handled really well. They get something really good out of this. But the team itself, they may have stock in the company or whatnot. They may not have anything, but that team, it's brought into this new organization. And what often happens with the new organization, if things aren't handled appropriately, you'll get these antibodies to start eating away at this newness, because they're a little bit jealous about what's going on. They're jealous of all this stuff. And they're also worried that it's going to uproot what they're doing inside their jobs, because some things are overlapping. My goal is to have within 3 to 5 years, my first Nemawashi Center, which will basically be a place where these acquisitions can take shape in a more meaningful way. So you have the C-suites from both the company that's being bought and the one that's the acquirer coming together, and then you rejigger that mission, understanding where all these puzzle pieces are going to go. And these people coming in from the startup side don't feel threatened and don't feel like they need to leave because they're not being appreciated and they're being pushed in the corner. What happens oftentimes is that when there's that buyout, that large organization, that company's stock just skyrockets. But 3, 4, 5 years down the road, if they haven't really incorporated that team, they start losing that innovative nature. Oftentimes their stock goes lower than it was in the beginning. It's because they wasted this resource. And it's that communication, it's that inability to understand all those new puzzle pieces and how they fit together. If they can do that, they can actually make things really soar. So the goal is to have at least my first one, which most likely be in California or Florida, and it'd be a place that would be a lot of meeting room space, auditorium space, lots of different spaces in regards to recreational type things. But they'd spend a week there and get to know each other better, and then get to know how they put these pieces of the puzzle together through these different language alignment, cultural alignment, mission alignment type activities.
This has been really interesting and sort of 30,000 feet. If a person resonates, but they want to dip their toe in, do you have a book or a podcast where they can start to understand a little more?
My book, which has been in the works for a couple of years, is finally coming to fruition, and that will be coming out. The tagline will be "Sync to the Beat of Success." That is something I would like people to look forward to. If they really want to get to know my background and everything, I would say that they should look me up on LinkedIn, John Taylor McEntire, and also at mutualprosperity.com is the company's URL.
John, I want to say thank you. You've led a fascinating life, and you're bringing to the table all the experiences from different cultures and what you've learned during that time. So I want to say thank you for being on the show today. Wayne Pratt, thank you for being here. And you, the Knack for Business listeners, if you're about to go through some massive change, or maybe you're not having good communication flow between your crew, as they're not syncing up properly, reach out to John. He has some solutions, and he can help get you that alignment and get that inner peace, get your EQ up.
To reach the podcast hosts, email them at info@creativeinsight.com or by the website creativeinsight.com, spelled KREATIVISIGHT.com. To reach Wayne at his email, wayne@motive8u.ca, that is MOTIVE, the numeral 8 and the letter u.ca, or his website, motive8u.ca. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast and share your knowledge, let us know. We would also appreciate your feedback on the content or format. Check the show notes for more details. For these podcasts, we like to acknowledge the support and thanks to the following people: Carl Richards from Podcast Solutions Made Simple, a renowned podcast expert; Fred Crouch, who is the Property Wizard podcaster, where Bernie is a co-host; Jovan Strika from At Hive, a co-working space that is more than just a space; then Melanie Weber, Bernie's invaluable business partner; and Wayne Pratt from Motive 8U Inc., who serves as both a coach and co-host of these podcasts. Disclaimer. Please note that the Knack for Business podcast episodes are meant solely for educational and general informational purposes. The information and opinions contained within are not intended to be professional advice on any subject matter. The thoughts, views, and opinions expressed by the participants are their own personal beliefs and do not represent the views of the podcast hosts or any affiliated organizations. It is important to note that this podcast is not a replacement for consulting with certified experts in your area who possess knowledge of your unique situation. The hosts of the podcast, along with any participants or affiliated groups, do not take responsibility for any actions taken or not taken based on the information presented in this episode. It is highly recommended that individuals seek guidance from their own personal advisors in fields such as accounting, law, or other pertinent areas prior to undertaking any actions or making decisions that may impact their financial, legal, or other aspects of life.